Across 1,000,000 battlefields, ancient enemies rise and legends return from myth. Imperial commanders are forced to adapt or be swept aside. The unending struggle continues in Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. And in this Warhammer Skulls season, we see another major update, with a huge run of events and content drops inspired by Dawn of War, bringing new game modes, new champions, and even the first ever Loyalist Primarch to the game. I play Tacticus pretty much daily to soothe that Warhammer 40,000 itch. It's very engaging to have something always progressing in the background. The guild I joined has been a nice relaxing bunch to fight alongside in the ongoing guild wars and raids, and your teammates can provide tips, support, advice for newcomers, most of all to help you progress in the game. Starting May 24th, players can jump into The Last Stand, a survival mode where you command Cyrus of the Blood Ravens. Then, from May 28th, there's a new campaign placing players in command of Necron forces in a desperate battle against the Dark Angels, which culminates in facing down Lionel Johnson himself. Then on May 31st, Chronomancer Thothmek joins Tacticus, bringing the bizarre Xenos use of time manipulation to the battlefield, something I'm especially pleased about for my Necron team. Then, still more, June 17th sees the Lion return as the newest guild raid boss. In Tacticus, the limited time events progression remains persistent. You will earn regular rewards and resupplies through various PvE and PvP options. There's a huge amount of new content coming this summer, so if you're new to Tacticus, Warhammer Skulls, and this update is a great time to jump in. Strike from the shadows or splinter time itself as you take command in Tacticus. And be sure to use my in-game code LutinXSkulls, and please do me the favour of clicking the links below or scanning the QR code on screen now to join the ever-growing community of Tacticus today. Welcome back once more. Today our topic is a significant event during the closing chapter of The Heresy, the war in the Webway. But more specifically, looking at how it's often barely thought of beyond being an isolated battle which just occurred prior to the Siege of TERRA. In fact, in terms of consequences felt, this engagement had a significant impact upon not only the concluding results of the Heresy, but indeed the Imperium itself through the coming 10,000 years. After the last video, I made a post asking for things that you guys would like me to cover. Vrax was high on the list, so I've bumped that up my pending list, as were things like Badab and more obscure elements like Blackstone Fortress explorations. But one thing remains ever notable, and that's when I'm asked, can you cover X niche thing, be that unification or whatever, the answer is technically yes, but the problem is they would be near entirely speculative. And lately I've had more complaints that I've been doing too much speculative content, despite it making up less than 20% of the videos I've made in the last 9 months. What I'm trying to say really is that no matter what you speak about in terms of 40k, there are always gaps, because it is rare for things to be fully resolved and documented beyond the likes of Imperial campaigns, specific characters, cumulative actions, and so on. But very obviously, some of those gaps are bigger than others. Some gaps make up 90% of a topic. And thus, by its nature, speaking about the lore requires speculation. And that's why I've always made it clear when I'm doing so by saying out loud before I go on to a tangent that this is purely my speculation. I've made that a foundational aspect of speaking about the lore. But from my point of view, being a person, a channel who speaks about the lore, likes to think of themselves as having a pretty good handle upon the lore, the whole point of speculating about things is that you know enough about everything else that's going on that you're able to make plausible, logical connections. You're not just talking a load of rubbish. And I think beyond that, you also have to have some understanding about science fiction, science, philosophy, culture, and so on. There's so many topics, especially in 40k lore, which are very captivating, pose many questions, but end up being ultimately barren on the specifics, and that makes it very difficult to speak to what that is about with any real weight or flesh. But at the same time, a lot of the lore is built around inspiration from historical events, culture, all of these other things. So you need to have that to draw from, because essentially otherwise all you're going to be doing is making a bullet point list. So speculation is one thing. I personally prefer to use the term plausible reasoning or logical rationalization. Essentially, things we cannot know, but until we know otherwise, it seems pretty reasonable to conclude that perhaps this is what contributed to a certain situation, decision, or action there otherwise. And so many of you have asked about the war in the Webway. In fact, so many times, and for all of the reasons I just laid out, I have been reticent to want to really discuss it, because such topics within the lore don't appeal to me naturally, because in my head, it's one of those things which took place, and then you're on to the next thing. Because the war in the Webway can really be summarised in a sentence, pretty much, that the Custodes in Mechanicus, Loyalist Mechanicum, whatever you want, they had a massive battle to prevent TERRA and the throne room being overrun by demonic hordes. Bang, there you go. Now, quite honestly, you could leave it at that. But the more you think about it, the more conclusions, in fact, there are to draw. Mainly being, of course, around the Emperor and his actions thereafter. And this will be our topic for today. It's also mostly covered in Master of Mankind. Now, can I lay this stuff out in a pointed, efficient fashion? Let's see. Probably not. So, the battle that would become known as the War in the Webway began long before the heresy itself. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace was a project so secret that even the Primarchs had no understanding of its true scale, which in part potentially led to the heresy. But it's also clear that it was so fundamental to the Emperor's grand plan, he couldn't risk to make its existence widely known, and unlike the existence of chaos itself, I feel this is one call that was pretty solid, because the less people who knew of this really, the better. But in retrospect, maybe Magnus should have been informed? Anyways, during the closing period of the Crusade, the Astartes had carried the Emperor's banners from one world to the next. They were nearing this comprehensive reunification of humanity's lost civilizations. And because the Astartes had been so successful, but also due to the extreme distances involved, the Emperor had become increasingly absent from the front lines. He was withdrawn, disconnected from his Primarchs and the legions. Instead of trusting him as the Master of Mankind, though, many took this unbelievably too personally, which is one of the aspects personally I find a bit grating about the whole thing, because yes, these are the superhuman warriors who dominated the galaxy, but were also irked by the absence of Dad. They considered he should have been present to conclude alongside them the final conquests that would found the new Imperium. I think it speaks a lot to the sort of pomp and circumstance which goes with the Astartes. They love all that. They love all the honours and badges and all this stuff. It's not just about the plain conquest. It's not about just getting it done. They want all the gloss and gold and gilt that goes along with it. Instead of that, though, deep beneath TERRA, the Emperor was consumed by work on a project that was planned to fundamentally change the trajectory of humanity's future. Hidden behind immense wards and psychic barriers, he had been constructing a human section of the ancient Eldari Webway. This was the labyrinthine alien network which existed between reality and the warp for millions of years ever since the War in Heaven and the Old Ones. It allowed the Eldar the security of moving between stars without ever having to touch the warp, and also moving very fast. This remained, for humanity, one of its still biggest obstacles: how to navigate the space of the galaxy. The Emperor, of course, knew that chaos could never be fundamentally defeated, as humanity and the warp were so inextricably linked. So his best hope was to rise above the need for reliance upon it, thus both starving it of human connection and diminishing the risks of corruption and breaching reality from those things which exist within the immaterium. For humanity, the implications of this would have been immense. Had his plan come to fruition, then humanity would no longer have needed to rely upon the likes of the navigators, the dangerous unstable warp routes. Their dependence upon the immaterium itself could have been greatly reduced. In the fullness of time, it's even possible that the human race may have been able to eventually step away from the horror and madness to rise and evolve to a new transcendent state of existence. There were those who disagreed, those who had known the Emperor as a perpetual and considered he was forcing humanity to just advance too quickly. Now, the reason for that still seems very elusive. Whether he had just seen something they had not, a vision, a future where it was entirely necessary to push things so aggressively now, or if it were just the frustration of having seen humanity fail in its technological zenith, the Golden Age, to where the Emperor just said, right, they had their chance, now it's me or oblivion. This is something we can't really know so far. But very clearly, having seen humanity slide into the dark age of technology and the age of strife, the Emperor made the choice, along with Malkador, that there needed to be a different way forward. His Webway project would of course consume vast resources. Entire sections of the Mechanicum were involved, powerful psychers, other notable individuals would just disappear into the bowels of the palace to do this secretive work. And while the custodian guard secured areas of the palace that most of the Imperium never knew would exist and likely still have no knowledge of their existence, the scale of the undertaking was so difficult to comprehend because of its secretive nature. Everything had to take place deep below the palace, to where entire areas just became small worlds of their own. There were now hidden cities of machinery and industry stretching beneath TERRA, vast power generators and engines of impossible complexity in unending operation, deep below the ordinary trappings of human bureaucratic affair. Mechanicum adepts worked within chambers whose purposes many of them likely never fully understood, and you see this in the contemporary Imperium still, where the Mechanicus now try to maintain the Golden Throne and the technologies of the Imperial Palace, but still many of them have no idea what to do unless it's already stated in cult scripture. But for all the technological power involved, the project depended heavily upon psychic mastery, something which was still in a burgeoning state for the Imperium in contrast to the likes of the Eldar. And this is of course because the Webway was not a technological thing, not simply a tunnel through space. The Webway is a psychic construct, and so likewise did the Emperor's warp bridge from TERRA exist in a state separated from conventional reality. Yet the Webway also exists in the unknowable, unimaginable, intangible space between reality. This meant that while separate, it also remained close enough to the warp that any breaches in the Webway tunnel could prove catastrophic. This was something long known to the Eldar, which is why they are seen to use so many varied wards and protective psychic seals and barriers with their own Webway. For humanity, this was very new, and the Emperor needed to ensure that every section built by humanity had similar protections. Every psychic fibre, each connection required its own wards and barriers, but the risk remained extremely high and the structure precarious. So we fast forward to the heresy. Horus has turned against the Imperium now, and Magnus, having eventually discovered the truth of the War Master's corruption and the scale of the disaster unfolding, tries to warn the Emperor. Now, as has been long debated, I believe Magnus's intentions were very genuine. He was attempting to save the Imperium. He'd always believed that knowledge of reality and space could overcome anything placed before him, and in this moment he reached for power on a scale that few beings in existence could have survived. The Emperor had taught Magnus how to traverse the galaxy in effectively a spirit form, to use the warp to travel across the ethereal plane, and so now, rather than send a conventional, vague astropathic message, Magnus infamously forced his consciousness toward TERRA. The urgency and his convictions was so extreme that to reach the Emperor, Magnus had to push through vast psychic protections he found surrounding the palace, layers of wards, seals, and mechanisms intertwined with the Golden Throne and the Webway project itself. Magnus, in that moment, saw nothing more important than to bring news of Horus's betrayal to the Emperor, and so he tore through those psychic protections. Magnus's comic tragedy rests upon the fact that he was both successful and that his efforts were entirely futile. in the greater picture. The disastrous event which unfolded records less a single great barrier being broken and more a sequence of layered protections collapsing under impossible pressure. The psychic shockwave which followed rippled through systems which had taken so many years to create. Magnus did reach his father and deliver the warning, but in doing so he struck an irreparable fracture through the very foundations of the Emperor's greatest project. And the damage was simply catastrophic. The psychic barriers surrounding the human webway shattered and collapsed, causing unfinished sections of the warp bridge extending from the great portal beneath TERRA to split open, and the instant they were compromised, the warp flooded in. It was nothing short of a complete psychic deluge of all humanity's worst nightmares. Demons poured in through great breaches, and there, smothered beneath their foul corruption, lay humanity's future, now bespoiled, contaminated, and potentially beyond repair. In that moment, the Emperor abandoned the Great Crusade entirely. He took his place upon the Golden Throne, but now the throne was not simply part of a greater design, it had changed its purpose into becoming an emergency measure. Sat atop it, the Emperor was forced to manually hold reality together through sheer psychic force, preventing the breach beneath TERRA from expanding further. The only problem would be, were he forced to vacate the throne, in the scenario where, for example, a civil war was taking place and a large fleet was headed for TERRA. Thus, beneath the Imperial Palace, a hidden war had now begun. Now, a small tangent to remember, that the Golden Throne, I made a whole video speaking about this a while ago, but with the throne it's somewhat unclear if the Emperor really intentioned that throne for his own use in the long term. And that folds into the whole spiel about foresight and if he was just covering his bases, or if he had really foreseen in similar fashion to Sanguinius or Kurz that there were certain eventualities that would just come to pass. Hence why the throne was built ahead of time to accommodate human souls to fuel it with psychic power. There's also the existence of these twin thrones out in the galaxy, and the origin for these is unclear. It appears that the Emperor potentially based his design upon these, for they were shown to be as equally powerful as the throne on TERRA, and that likely it was originally intended for Magnus to sit upon the throne, not necessarily the Emperor, and that post-Great Crusade Magnus would have sat upon the throne, but not as a suffering, tormented figure like the Emperor now endured. Magnus would have sat there as humanity's psychic guardian, able to explore the galaxy in his ethereal form, whilst also controlling and maintaining that web portal for humanity, essentially acting as kind of the new lighthouse for humanity. And also personally, I truly believe that the Emperor did not just see Magnus as a battery to install on the throne to suffer for all eternity. I think he had taken the time to help Magnus explore beyond outside of his physical form, because I think he knew that one day Magnus would be tethered physically, yes, to the throne, but he could be free in other ways in a spirit form to traverse and watch over the Imperium. Anyway, of course, that did not come to pass. The heresy instead spread across the galaxy, worlds burned even as the war in the Webway was unfolding in secrecy. The defenders at first in the Webway were of course the Custodians, the Sisters of Silence, as well as Mechanicum forces sent into this labyrinth beneath TERRA. Unfortunately, they were effectively battling the entire warp, thus their enemy was infinite. As much as they were able to secure ground or repair the Webway where they could, more and more demons just poured in. Steadily things became ever worse, psychic tears widened, weak points tore, collapsing adjacent stable space, and the defenders just found themselves fighting an enemy which ignored any assumptions upon which war normally depended. These were the first signs of what would become all-encompassing later in the siege, that the walls of reality itself were beginning to fail. To the point where, during the siege itself, even maps of the Imperial Palace became useless because reality and known orientation just became meaningless. But for now, the defenders in the Webway experienced their own versions of this. Distances changed without warning. Entire passages could appear stable and then shift into impossible forms. regions secured one day and marked as stable could become entirely inaccessible the next. Demonic forms they fought fully embodied this strange bizarrity, this instability. They emerged in numbers that increased steadily, while their very presence altered environments around them. Areas touched by sustained corruption just ceased to follow ordinary law, and reality began to erode. I will note also that in the war in the Webway, there are several notable figures who have appeared before, like Samus and Drachnian, who is the demon of course, which later would be in Abaddon's sword, etc, etc. So there are these named occurrences and conflicts which occur in the Webway. I'm not really getting into those because, as interesting as they are at a character level, they don't really speak to the greater picture, which is what I'm looking at today. Now, inevitably, the fighting was unlike any conventional war in the Webway. For the Custodies in particular, this represented something they had rarely, if ever, experienced in their history, but also that they were in part designed to do. They'd never been really intended, though, as a force of attrition. They were designed to cope with such horrors, but not necessarily at this scale. Because every custodian had required extraordinary efforts to create them. They were unique individuals, and thus their numbers had always been smaller compared to that mass, arguably more anonymous armies of the Imperium. But here they were dragged into a conflict which saw their names become meaningless. All that counted was to hold the line. It was a pragmatic, grinding war, more the kind of thing that you would see the Krieg take care of. There were no glorious campaigns, no triumphant declarations. There were no cities to raise banners upon, save for bizarre abandoned Eldar cities to be accurate. There were no populations who celebrated their victory, no worlds to retell great sacrifices. This was an entirely sterile conflict, binary in some sense. It was win or lose and nothing in between. This was the only metric which really counted for anything, and the environment was so incredibly alien for these elevated custodies. Entire shield companies just disappeared into the dark, surging masses of hate never to be seen again. Imperial losses just accumulated steadily as the pressure upon them grew ever worse. The finest warriors ever created were now being consumed by a war that the wider Imperium would never even known to have existed. The heresy progressed, and the Webway conflict also continued. Its conditions deteriorated still further though, as now demons of all four great powers were seen to appear in increasing numbers. The pressure upon the Emperor became greater with every passing day. What had originally required his clear-minded focus, now every moment that passed upon the Golden Throne demanded unimaginable effort. The throne was the singular seal holding back the shattered walls of reality itself, and the Emperor was the source of power holding it in place. Should he fail, then TERRA would be consumed by the unimaginable horrors of the warp, and chaos would dominate the galaxy. Vulcan returned to TERRA, but his arrival carried more significance than just a returning loyalist son. For Vulcan had always possessed an unusual relationship with endurance and sacrifice in his very nature, as the only perpetual among the Primarchs. He knew what it was to be destroyed and live again, so that by the time he reached TERRA, he'd already endured in the heresy immense personal suffering. But now a new burden was placed upon him by the Emperor, and this took the form of the Talisman of Seven Hammers, and I speak more to this in my video about the Golden Throne, recommend you check that out. And this was not a weapon in the conventional sense, it was more of a hedge against oblivion, a spiteful counterbalance should a war that determined the fate of all become a lost hope. But of course, Vulcan being who he was not particularly happy when he learned of what the Emperor had him forge. But that's by the by, because what's important about the talisman is that its existence says more about the Emperor's thinking, which as we know is often the case with the Emperor, because he speaks so little and often does so in strange poetic phrasings, so you've got to read between the lines. In forging the talisman, the dead man's switch for the Golden Throne, which should the warp seal collapse would destroy TERRA itself, we can see that in creating this, and even while still attempting to save humanity's future, he was prepared for failure. And you may think, well, that's just pretty sensible, anybody would do that. Sure, except that the Emperor is not anybody. He is the all-knowing master of mankind. He has the plan for humanity's future. He knows exactly what he is doing and where he is going. So the fact that he felt it necessary to construct such a device in the first place meant that for perhaps the first time since all of this began, he had now a doubt. In fact, at this point, the reality facing the Imperial forces was something none would have ever consciously admitted, that the war beneath TERRA had already become unwinnable. Now, of course, there are beautifully descriptive details of the conflict within the Webway War itself, most of which is, as I say, detailed in Master of Mankind. It's essential reading for understanding 40k and the heresy lore. But what I would focus on now is not a blow-by-blow retelling, like I said, of Custodes Ra, Diocletian, and the like, because the takeaway is more about the implications upon the Emperor. Now, certainly as the war progressed, it was not going well, to the point where it became fully clear finally that the Emperor would have to intervene. And this is where he would also implement a sanction placed upon the Sisters of Silence, who would for the first time ever use human psykers to power the throne, and in doing so realise the horror of what had been created in the Golden Throne. Later still, of course, some sisters, when they realised post-heresy that the Emperor would require a continual feed of technically innocent humans as sacrifice, there was certainly a moment where even those most loyal to the Emperor gave pause to question the morality of just what they were doing. And I know that people always joke and laugh about morality existing in the Imperium, but you have to remember that in this period, in the days of the early Imperium, these kind of questions counted a lot more than they might in M41. But for the Webway War to conclude, we first see the Emperor leaving the Golden Throne now for a brief period to enter the Webway. Things became so serious that he had to make his presence there. And when he does, he arrives to fight in a blazing psychic inferno alongside the Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, other Imperial forces. He even summons to his side the Imperial dead, including the souls of Custodes, those lost at Isfahan. There's even speculation about the spiritual avatar of Ferrus Manus appearing in this time, but that has been fairly poured water on by the author themselves. Regardless though, with the Emperor now alongside them, he invigorates the Imperials with power and they push the enemy back, but only still for a time. Chaos had committed so heavily to the Webway War that even with the Emperor participating, the deluge had just become impossible now to contain. So the Emperor eventually was forced to admit, despite everything, and to himself, a conclusion he had resisted for so long. The order was given to retreat as sections of the human Webway were destroyed and sealed behind its withdrawing defenders. The Imperials escaped back into the throne room if they were able to. Many were lost, but so was the Imperial Webway project. For thousands of years, humanity had depended upon warp travel, forced to accept the inherent and numerous dangers involved. The Emperor had attempted to create an alternative path, one which could steadily separate mankind from the influence of chaos. But now, in the moment that the Emperor emerged from the Webway, saw the destruction of his great project, and with a clenched fist sat once more upon the Golden Throne to seal the Webway and TERRA from the horrors within, he knew that now humanity would likely remain tied to those irresistible forces forever. The Emperor stated himself, "The war is over, Diocletian. Win or lose, Horus has damned us all. Mankind will share in his ignorance until the last man or woman draws the species' last breath. The warp will forever be a cancer in the heart of all humans. The Imperium may last 100 years, or 1,000, or 10,000. But it will fall, Diocletian. It will fall. The shining path is lost to us. Now we rage against the dying of the light." The Custodes in question refuses this bleak view and says instead to the Master of Mankind, "You are the Emperor of Mankind. We will conquer any who come against us. After the war, we will rebuild under your guidance. To which the Emperor stoically replies, "And what if I am gone, Diocletian?" The Emperor knows that with the collapse of the Webway, this is the end, which is played out by the fact that even after Horus was defeated and the heresy ended, the Imperium remained forced to continue navigating through the warp, astropaths still screaming their messages across impossible distances with vague blurs of emotive, unclear communication. Navigators still guiding ships through seas of pure chaos. And most of all, humanity remains tied to the tides of the warp, as was seen with the emergence of the Rift. Humanity's existence in the material galaxy leaves them vulnerable to so many threats caused by the warp, both in material and immaterial sense, not least the predations and corrupting influences of the dark powers. Many humans can be corrupted or their minds destroyed simply by looking up at the Rift. So the future the Emperor had been building beneath TERRA now fell into ruin, and this was long before the siege reached its fateful conclusion. Until that time, the Emperor returned now to the Golden Throne to resume his vigil, but in a quiet, bitter frustration, knowing that so many paths were now closed, his options severely diminished. In fact, so significantly, there were few options now open to him that would allow any new path forward. I think in some sense, when he emerged from the Webway to sit upon the throne, he knew that he would never truly leave it again. In Master of Mankind, there's a huge weight placed upon that moment specifically, and I feel that it's for that exact reason. There's a greater significance to how things played out with the Webway conflict and Magnus's actions, and that is in those choices made by the Emperor that would come to pass as the Siege of TERRA finally arrived. Because unknown to so many of the defenders upon TERRA as Horus finally arrived, much of the outcome had already been decided beneath the Imperial Palace. For example, the Emperor is now forced to remain on the throne. He's been removed basically from the wider war. Imagine the Siege of TERRA, but with the Emperor leading the charge. It's an almost incomprehensible situation, and one wonders if Horus would have ever fought the Emperor in such a scenario. More significantly though, of course, was this great malaise now that the Emperor descended into, given that his greatest project had been crushed before completion. While practically immense resources of TERRA had been thrown into defending it, thousands of custodians sacrificed when they would have counted greatly during the siege. The war in the Webway was a conflict that remained hidden from near all, yet among all the battles of the Horus heresy, few carried greater consequence than the hidden war deep beneath the palace itself. For while TERRA was not consumed by a deluging mass of infinite demonic horrors, the Emperor was in many ways still already defeated. The true cost of the war in the Webway is difficult to measure, because the conflict was never witnessed by the wider Imperium. There were no remembrances recording glorious victories, no triumphal celebrations on liberated worlds, no public declarations of sacrifice. Most of humanity never knew the war had happened at all. The few trusted to exist within the deepest areas of the palace may have seen the Emperor confined to the Golden Throne. Most others on the surface saw TERRA pushed to the edge of collapse. In the era of ruin, the survivors were left digging through the remnants and ashes of a war beyond all comprehension, but they still could never imagine the conflict which had taken place deep beneath them. The Custodes suffered devastating casualties throughout the conflict. Before the heresy, the 10,000 represented perhaps the greatest concentration of martial perfection in the Imperium. Now, so many were gone, and they could not easily be replaced. In the heresy as a whole, the Custodes suffered heavy losses, but nowhere did that attrition strike with such persistence and brutality as in the Webway. It's one of the reasons why in the aftermath they remained confined to TERRA for so long, because unlike the Astartes who could recover their numbers fairly quickly, this was not the case for the Custodes, and also that they slipped into a deep depression and grief with the aftermath of the Emperor's battle with Horus. The Sisters of Silence paid a terrible cost as well. In many respects, their role was uniquely valuable within the conflict, Their null presence disrupted warp entities and created rare moments of stability against enemies whose existence itself depended upon the Immaterium. Yet they too were a finite resource. Every death weakened one of the few tools the Imperium possessed that directly hindered demonic power. Throughout the war, they fought alongside the Custodes, but in the aftermath they became horribly persecuted by the Ecclesiarchy, and seemingly the Custodes, so preoccupied in their grief, were content to let this happen. The sisters slid back into the shadows. They hid and existed only in places where they could be respected and understood by those who truly saw their worth. So that by M41, they had been effectively replaced by the Grey Knights, and the few sisters who remained were left to operate the Black Ships, gathering psychers for sacrifice to the throne. An ignominious end to an order who had done more to protect humanity than most could ever know or be able to comprehend. Mechanicum forces suffered heavily too, of course. Titans, cybernetic constructs, battle automata, countless personnel disappeared beneath TERRA. Most of these losses became difficult to quantify again because records are all but non-existent. The war itself unfolded in regions of the Webway where physical laws no longer behaved predictably, and so entire sections of the Imperial Webway were just destroyed or sealed, and in doing so some defenders, their groups, their titans, just vanished into regions that ceased functioning according to normal reality, and their fate is just unknown. One of the reasons as to why, again, I didn't go into a blow-by-blow retelling of the Webway War, though, is that the numbers are just really irrelevant in some respects. The conflict itself is not the story. It's the greater threat that may have been had these forces been absent. It's the realizations that were had in the final moments between the Emperor and his closest advisors. Every custodian fighting in the Webway was one who would later not be there to stand upon the walls of the Imperial Palace. Every sister lost beneath TERRA represented another missing from the final battle for humanity, absent from disrupting the masses of demons or from protecting innocents from the destabilizing reality all around them. As I've noted, it's the siege that's remembered as the point where the Imperium reached its absolute limit, to where it could give nothing more. And in some respects that's true. Astartes lay amid the dead in the blood and the filth, still stabbing their brothers who lay alongside them with their last ounce of strength, all exhausted. But it's not where the end began. The hidden war for TERRA is where this took place. When Horus arrived superficially, Dawn's immense works presented a fortress ready to repel on the strongest possible terms. Yet in actuality, this was a fortress that had already been slowly bleeding from within. It was wounded, and the absence of the Emperor himself was the most visible evidence of this. How else can I speak to the cost of this? Well, that's where speculation begins, but it remains grounded in what we know of the forces involved. Most obviously, had Magnus never shattered the Emperor's wards, the positive consequences would have been significant. Even if we set aside the preservation of the Webway project itself, just count the fact that the defenders of TERRA then would have looked radically different. Imagine the Custodes entering the siege at near full strength, led by a raging Emperor, surrounded by a psychic firestorm. The traitors would have simply been swept away. The Custodes, rather than presenting diminished token numbers against the traitors, would have seen instead the sight of the full 10,000 stood ready upon the palace walls, which in itself would have been an immense psychological barrier. Remembering that the Custodes, first and foremost, are Astartes killers. They're designed to be able to slaughter Astartes the way a Space Marine could dispatch guardsmen. They're near to invincible fighting against Space Marines. They're truly terrifying, and 10,000 could surely annihilate a legion. And as I noted, with the sisters creating a resistance to the psychic disruption and warp projections, the impact would have been incredibly significant. Perhaps most of all, the Mechanicum situation could have changed things as well. Titans and specialized forces lost beneath TERRA would have instead arrived as reinforcements to weakening defensive positions throughout the palace, or sent out to strengthen Imperial counterattacks. During the siege, one of the most notable things is that every engagement, like saturnine comes down to the best singular efforts of every individual. So had there been more substantial backing up to bring out, who knows how that could have shifted the balance. The Emperor, though, of course, remains the largest piece of the puzzle, not simply in his physical presence on the battlefield, but also just having the ability to more easily counsel and allow him to direct forces during the battle itself. Because after Magnus, the Emperor effectively disappeared from the wider heresy, rather than acting as a grand strategist, commander and active participant. He was just down there in the throne room, tied to the throne. Only in the last moments that finally presented an end to it all did his role then change. Essentially, the aftermath of the war in the Webway is one of the quietest shifts in the heresy, because the Emperor did not emerge from it carrying some revised master plan or new direction for us. He emerged for the first time somewhat broken, a figure forced into a bitter retreat. Perhaps disillusionment is not entirely the correct word for what followed, but it's certainly true to say that by this point, the Emperor had witnessed too much throughout his existence for simple despair to fit comfortably. He'd lived through Old Earth, the Age of Strife. He'd watched empires rise and collapse. He'd spent millennia guiding humanity through periods of extraordinary violence and uncertainty. I think now, with the end of the Webway as a possibility of things, something did break inside of him. Because there's a fundamental difference between observing the failures of others in a single battle, a campaign, versus watching a design, an effort made over tens, if not hundreds of years or more, your final grand design of your own creation collapse into darkness. The Webway project had required commitment unlike almost anything else during the Crusade, especially where the Emperor withdrew from it. Then also beyond the Emperor, only Malcador, to no surprise, appears to be the one with the ability to truly comprehend this changing reality, to understand what this meant. Because throughout the later material, especially into the Siege, you begin to get this sense that even victory itself for the Imperium is becoming a difficult, more vague concept to define, that preserving what remains has already begun to replace the idea of achieving a greater ultimate triumph. It's not about what are we doing and where are we going anymore, it's just about holding on. Because clearly the death of Horus was not the end of this. It's not as if that singular moment just restored all that had been lost. Entirely the opposite, in fact. And that's where we go to the Dark King. Now, I've not spoken much about the Dark King before. I know people would love to discuss it, and I've been asked about this a lot, but I really don't think there's a significant amount to get into. But in this context, it is worth mentioning, because during the closing period of the Siege, we begin to see the disturbing possibility arise that the Emperor may be transcending into something terrible and absolute. This is the Dark King. Now, if you're unaware, the Dark King is something which appeared for us in the final books of the Siege of TERRA. It's really this vague concept which most likely sees a possible future with the idea of the Emperor no longer resisting using the warp itself. He goes in the opposite direction. He begins taking in so much warp power that he stops merely being the Emperor and becomes something else entirely, the Dark King. Now, most often, this is rationalized as becoming closer to a fifth godlike power in the warp. This is why sometimes people say the Emperor kind of is already in the warp and is a god already, but it's all very unknown. But this idea of the Emperor becoming the Dark King, this other sort of chaos god, is of course something that the gods of the warp seem entirely happy to see take place. In fact, maybe this is really their preference, certainly what they expected to happen. So the fact that it did not was extremely disruptive for them. But just as the Cabal predicted for humanity, there's no clean outcome either way when it comes to destroying chaos. Either it had to be burned out or it will slowly destroy humanity, and either way mankind still will be ultimately destroyed as well. And so far how the Cabal kind of saw things going is pretty much how it is going for humanity in M41. But really, the important part about the Dark King was that this was just a potential outcome. And this is where you come back to the Emperor and Eldar Farseers like Eldrad Ulthran, who are able to see basically different pathways. The Emperor and Malcador called these configurations, that when an event changes, it restructures potential future options, and this is why the closing of the Webway was devastating. It was so destructive, because it now closed so many options for the Emperor. He no longer knew which of the very limited paths which remained to follow. Seemingly sometime later during the siege, though, he made a decision. He now saw a path where he gained overwhelming power, Horus can be destroyed absolutely, and maybe he can exert control over events being forced otherwise into existence. But the unknown elements to this are extraordinarily dangerous, because most likely the cost would be enormous. And it's not firmly established, but I would speculate, and it seems largely accepted, that if the Emperor followed the path to becoming the Dark King, humanity would effectively lose any kind of potential future. Its freedom would be gone, it would be dominated totally by the Emperor, even more than it already was. The Emperor would also become this vast, ambiguous, terrible figure, essentially a chaos god by any other name. And worst of all, he would become the thing which he had spent millennia trying to resist, and just now allow himself to be consumed by raw warp power. Now, although it appears late in the novels, the Dark King represents this central theme, really, for the heresy, that of having access to and allowing oneself to use unlimited power for whatever means you rationalize as being necessary, be that to save humanity or to perhaps ultimately destroy what makes humanity worth saving. But thankfully at the last moment, the Emperor is of course confronted by Ol P and is basically slapped back into sanity. He recognizes the danger and rejects the path, much of course to the fury of the Chaos Gods, who now go all in on Horus. But nonetheless, the possibility of this having happened is what's important, because this isn't something that just emerges during the opening years of the Crusade, not during humanity's expansion, nor during periods of otherwise optimism and constructive growth about this new Imperium. It emerges only when the Emperor is backed into this corner and he sees no other way. He has seen his sons betray him, he has watched the Imperium tear itself apart, he's lost the Webway now. Terror is burning around him. And so, if we're looking through the lens of an Emperor making sincere choices, you now have an Emperor who sees these options narrowed to where only a single path suddenly appears before him, and it seems feasible. He's run out of time, he hasn't got any time left to reflect upon things. It's now or never. Take the power, take enough that defeat becomes impossible. And this is another core theme of the heresy. It's this sense of taking or securing or otherwise acquiring power that any who dared resist you will just cease to matter. And this can take different forms depending on who it is and their perspective and their experience. Magnus, for example, believed that knowledge would overcome anything. You've got Horus, who believed that just raw strength and will could reshape reality as he saw it, this incomprehensible possibility in the future of himself leading a new, dark Imperium. So the Emperor found himself standing at the edge of a similar mistake. From his perspective, the Dark King offered him certainty, but only through overwhelming power, a power that he perhaps could not fully control. Yes, he gained the ability to force the galaxy into obedience, but it came at a cost that remained essentially unfathomable. It certainly wouldn't have been good had it come to pass. In terms of the cost and impact of the Webway War, there was also one other thing which comes to mind, which is, when exactly did the Grey Knights become implicitly necessary? Now, their foundations emerged during the siege itself through, of course, Malcador's gatherings of exceptional individuals, uncorruptible individuals, and that was the formation of the Knights Errant, where you had figures like Nathaniel Garrow. Now, not all would follow the path offered by Malcador to Titan, but regardless, the events which started quite early into the heresy eventually became part of a much larger design which led to the Grey Knights that followed in the aftermath. But the interesting question is in the timing of all this. Were the Grey Knights all but inevitable once Garrow identified what humanity now faced, or was it only once the siege had begun? And one wonders if the Webway breach is in fact what changed humanity's situation so completely, because before that point Chaos was certainly dangerous, but it often remained distant. When we think about all of what had occurred before, you hadn't really seen this immense battle against chaos. So it remained very fragmented, poorly understood, even by a lot of Astartes. Now, after the breach beneath TERRA, things were starkly clear as to what they faced, because chaos had reached directly into the foundations of humanity's future and forced the Emperor himself into accepting defeat on basically his greatest project. So now the Imperium was not the same that existed before, and I think it's likely that the Emperor and Malcador both then saw that humanity could no longer pretend that demonic war was just a distant, vague horror waiting beyond the edge of existence. It had arrived. It had kicked down the door to the Imperial Palace. And so the Grey Knights now are more than just a response to the aftermath of the siege. They were an inevitable consequence of the Webway's destruction. That if humanity could no longer escape the warp, then it would naturally need defenders built specifically for that new reality. Not Custodes, nor Astartes, a new breed of warrior, something created from the very beginning to understand the existential threat which existed, who could be incorruptible and fight the enemy in a way no human would have ever imagined possible, other than those who had witnessed what was lost to mankind beneath TERRA itself. So I hope this has made some sense, because the whole video has been helpful for me in focusing thoughts toward the larger truth surrounding the war in the Webway. Certainly the Siege of TERRA is remembered. It was visible, it was terrible, it was the final confrontation between Horus and the Emperor. It was the time where the fate of the Imperium hung in the balance. Humanity prevailed, it survived. But the war in the Webway left a deeper scar, because it was one which cut into humanity's future itself. As the war beneath TERRA concluded, humanity had unknowingly suffered this defeat, greater than the loss of any battle or world. The heresy still raged, Horus still marched toward TERRA, the final confrontation was yet to come. The Imperium would fight on, even as its legions continued burning worlds in the Emperor's name or against it, but a fundamental change had occurred, one that could never be walked back. People always think that the end to the heresy is the battle between Horus and the Emperor. That's the breaking point which divides the era of potential enlightenment and the dark, slow stagnation that the Imperium fell into in the aftermath. But it was in fact the closing of the Webway project and the Emperor being forced to admit defeat, in my opinion. The great powers of the warp had won a victory here, perhaps greater in the full picture than the destruction of any single army or the corruption of the Primarchs. Humanity's opportunity to free itself from the Immaterium died beneath the Imperial Palace, and with this vanished the possibility of a future where mankind might one day step beyond the reach of the gods waiting behind the veil. So, the Imperium would still win its battles, its wars, TERRA would survive for the coming 10,000 years. But the laughter of the ancient hungry powers would echo through the darkness of that time. And I think this event is very important because it underscores the tragedy, the grim, dark nature which sits at the heart of Warhammer 40,000 as a setting. For all the glory of the Astartes, the propaganda of the Administratum, the Inquisition, the Ecclesiarchy, the galaxy of 40k has never truly been about humanity standing against impossible enemies alone. And I've mentioned this before, but I love to reiterate that for as much as the wars against the Xenos and Chaos are front and centre, they're felt very pressing, they're not the most common or even the most dangerous threats faced by mankind. The most pervasive war is the one which exists beneath the surface, the one which sees humanity struggle endlessly against itself, rebellions, corruption, and this allows the very worst predations of chaos, entities and alien horrors to get their teeth in on the edges. From the earliest foundations of the heresy, the story became about a species reaching toward greatness, but then it began to fracture beneath the weight of its own flaws, its own hypocrisy. The long road which saw the steady decline of the Imperium, it didn't begin at the Siege of TERRA, it began when humanity lost their future. In the contemporary time, only those who have that knowledge, such as Guilliman in the Imperium of M41, can look back to see the long shadow still cast by those sealed tunnels beneath the Imperial Palace. The Webway project wasn't just some new piece of technology that was going to rebuild an empire broken in the aftermath of the Age of Strife. It was a new thing entirely. It was a doorway which led to another future, a new path to remake the wrongs of the Dark Age of technology. And one of the most enduring questions has always been just what plan the Emperor was operating on. With the stagnation of technological development, he appears to have understood, perhaps more clearly than anybody else, that humanity's future couldn't just rest forever upon navigators looking into hell and finding a path through. Something that's made all too clear by the severe isolation imposed now upon the section of the galaxy referred to as Imperium Nihilis, or the Dark Imperium. It also couldn't really rely upon technology anymore, because despite his best efforts with the Imperial Truth, the Mechanicum still exist, and I talked about this recently as well, that you still have the Cult Mechanicus, you still have restrictions placed very heavily on the advancement of technology. And so this idea that humanity is just going to find its way back to the Zenith time is not going to happen. The Emperor understood that, and this is why he had to create a new direction, which effectively just circumnavigated that problem. The Webway project, had it succeeded, would have solved so many issues, and also avoided future threats like the Necron and the Tyrannid. Humanity could have expanded and evolved while separated from the tides of chaos. It would have been more resilient, less prone to the whispers in the dark, the insidious seeds of corruption, the situations which necessitated actions that then ultimately cause greater disaster than had nothing been done at all. Humanity could have found a true escape, a space to develop, and in the fullness of time emerge perhaps once more into the galaxy as a race of technological mastery and psychic zenith, the masters of all once more. Maybe that wouldn't have even been necessary. Maybe the Webway theoretically contains infinite space to build within. But then I started asking myself, well, then there's questions as to the ultimate purpose and meaning of your existence. Like, what are you doing there with infinite time and no threat to you? For me, there's also additional questions like, well, it's all good being in the Webway, but how do you produce all the resources required for life and construction and so on? Regardless, the possibility to explore any of those questions is really gone. The Imperium of M41 never had the opportunity to become a civilization ascendant toward enlightenment or mastery, as humanity once had been. Instead, it's this raw machine of human survival built upon ritualized repetition, duty, and attrition. Entire worlds maintain their functionality only because they always have. Populations labour and die under the crushing weight of oppressive systems older than living memory. The creations of the Emperor hold the edges from fraying apart entirely and the Imperium just unravelling, but even so, whole sections of the Empire just missing or threadbare. The return of the 13th Primarch appeared to momentarily change the shape of things to come, but the efforts and their results now seem to be fleeting. In some sense, there's a newfound feeling of purposeful direction still, a sense of potential, hope more than despair. But even Guilliman himself often feels like a man who awoke inside the shattered ruins of a once glorious empire. One of the great unifying story elements of the return of the Primarch has been that of the grimdark tragedy, whereby he saw in his horror the state to which the Imperium and humanity had crumbled and collapsed across the 10,000 years which spanned the aftermath of the heresy. He has inherited what was left of his father's empire stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. But even in his attempts to now remake the glory of Ultramar, largely he exists alongside the Astartes to fight in wars across regions of space torn apart by vast fleets of alien killing machines and the insidious rift. Guilliman has made his best attempt to reform what remains, but in all too human fashion, he discovered even this was not a straightforward task. Attempting to help those who need help the most, he found himself facing a civilization that frequently resists constructive change as though change itself were disease. The Imperium to me is imagined as 1,000 people all trying to clamber onto a small boat, each dragging each other down with the slim possibility for survival. Likewise, Guilliman now finds himself drowning under the weight of 10,000 years of accumulated propaganda, lies, and bureaucracy. Despite the forward-leaning efforts of Guilliman, there is so much which stands against anything that might be true progression. But let's just suppose tomorrow the Emperor returns completely, that in a blinding earthquake and flash of light, he's resurrected and stands from the golden throne to walk once more among mankind. What then? I don't think it would be the positive unifying outcome that all would expect. I think most likely the Imperium is dragged back down into another civil war with disparate arguing factions. I don't think all would immediately accept the new reality. The religious groups would probably splinter, they'd all be debating about whether this was the true Emperor now or not. And I note that only to underscore the fact that the Webway project was built under immense efforts by the Emperor, not just to make it, but before that, to unify, to focus humanity together. Remember how long it took the Emperor to be seen as the figure he is, that they would go to worlds who would just not accept at all that he was this grand, unifying, enlightened figure? Immense time and effort to create this sense of unwavering trust and direction in humanity, and all of that was building towards going to the Webway. So now, even if a returning Emperor and Guilliman stood alongside the genius creations of Call, the strange quasi-truce with the Necron, which saw chaos receding, the Great Rift closed, all that would do is allow another darkness to step into its place. And as I've mentioned previously, the Tyranids are by any metric a truly unstoppable force. By any logic, they should have already consumed vast sectors of the Imperium, not to mention that so far what we've seen may only be the first scattered conflicts of a greater storm. Now, perhaps a returning Emperor could lead a new solution. Maybe Call and Guilliman would spearhead a psychic null field we've been talking about recently that could disrupt the Tyranids, and I've speculated that might happen in the future. But it still feels nowhere near as complete a solution. It's still a struggle. It's nothing as straightforward as the Webway isolation would have been. And I don't think we're talking about isolation in the sense of just hiding behind walls forever like the Jakari. I think more isolation in the sense of a deliberate, planned sense of control. Humanity would, similarly to the Eldar, possess a road and network separate from conventional space where galactic movement, communication, and expansion could have existed, for the most part, beyond the reach of many dangers that would press inward from every side. At each entrance would be stationed immense forces of the Imperium to guard against any incursion. But instead of all this, instead without any vision like that of the Emperor or the knowledge to do so, there's nowhere left to go. Humanity in M41 really does rage against the dying light. The Imperium exists only to fight endless enemies. There's no hidden sanctuary waiting beyond the horizon. There's no final refuge beneath TERRA. No great design slowly unfolding behind the scenes. There's no hope. The Emperor realized this 10,000 years ago when he spoke to his custodies and closed the Webway gate. The grim darkness of the far future is that of defeat. A defeat many do not even realize they're living, as humanity stands beneath ever-darkening skies, saturated with enemies. Even the greatest victories provide no new pathway. The Emperor does not walk amongst humanity. Whatever remains of him is the crushed vessel which once held the hope of all mankind. Now, all that remains are the vestiges of this, tethered to the vast biomechanical construct deep in the heart of TERRA, where each passing day, despite the best efforts of the Mechanicus and even the Eldari, the throne becomes ever more unstable and unreliable. The future of humanity post-heresy was always to ask, can we survive? And they have. But the question now seems to be ever more, will anyone ever be able to deliver some sense of true salvation to the Imperium and mankind? Increasingly, the only answer to this seems to rest upon the God Emperor once more. Will he rise, reincarnate, transcend, otherwise empower his followers, or fade into complete oblivion forever, taking with him the last hope for humanity's future.